Steph?
Leah?
Jess? Is this line secure?
Welcome to another episode of Secure Line. I'm Leah West.
And I'm Jessica Davis.
And today we are excited to be joined by Dr. Colin P. Clarke, who's a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center and is the director of research at the Soufan Group. Dr. Clarke serves as part of the Research Advisory Council of the Resolve Network and is a member of the advisory board at the International Counterterrorism Review. Clarke has testified before Congress on numerous occasions as an expert witness on terrorism-related issues. He appears frequently in the media to discuss national security matters and has published several books on terrorism, including Terrorism, the Essential Reference Guide, Terrorism, Inc., and his most recent, After the Caliphate, the Islamic State, and the Future Terrorist Diaspora. Welcome, Dr. Clarke. Colin, nice to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me on.
This is our second episode looking at the current state of the terrorism threat. In our first episode, we looked at the threat in Canada with Stuart Bell and also broke down some of Jess's recent findings. And we're excited to have you here so that we can widen the aperture and look at the threat from a global perspective. You recently published a piece for the Foreign Policy Research Institute entitled Trends in Terrorism: What's on the Horizon in 2025? As I understand it, this is an analytical task you, for some reason, undertake every year.
Right. Yeah.
The piece went up in January 10th in the early aftermath of the attack in New Orleans, pretty quickly after the fall of the Assad regime. And also last year, we had the crippling of Hezbollah and Hamas. I want to get into all of that, but I have to say January 10th feels like 8 lifetimes ago. Is there anything that you would have included had you written it now and not just 6 weeks ago?
A lot has happened in the past few weeks, and I think there's still a lot that's potentially on the horizon. We're seeing news from multiple directions every day about what the Trump administration is planning to do, what they might do, what they're considering. And just yesterday, there was a suggestion that AFRICOM, our combatant command overseeing the African continent, may be folded back into European command, where it initially came from. I think it was Courtney Kubier from NBC that broke the news, kind of just did a little reminder quote tweet showing data, because data is always a good thing to have before you make huge decisions.
It's helpful.
Especially foreign policy decisions. You know, some people will make decisions based on politics, some on ideology, but I always think data is a good thing to use. That's just the social scientist in me. The Global Terrorism Index shows that half of terrorism deaths worldwide have occurred not even just in sub-Saharan Africa, just in the Central Sahel alone. So this is a huge, area of contention. We've got numerous groups, JNIM, various ISIS affiliates operating there. The U.S. is withdrawn. So folding AFRICOM back into EUCOM would seem like an odd choice. I think there's logistical hurdles there. What's the lag effect between folding that back in? What happens in the meantime? And I also think it just sends a really terrible message to our African partners that they're not a priority at a time when they're facing the most dire terrorist threat that they faced. I think right now what we're seeing across the board is a couple of areas where the U.S. is preparing to withdraw or draw down from. And I would add to that list Syria and Somalia.
Colin, I've done a fair bit of work on and in Africa and the terrorism problem. What do you think some of the main issues are in that very large region in terms of terrorist groups and their capabilities and what the future there looks like in the short term?
Yeah, I think right now I'm really looking closely at the Horn of Africa for the Trump administration, which has signaled a kind of pullback or retrenchment across the globe. They've been quite active so far in the new year in Africa. There's been several high-level drone strikes in Somalia. There's been several in Syria as well. My sense is, and this is just a hunch, that a lot of these kinetic strikes are laying the groundwork to a withdrawal, of basically saying we've neutralized the threat. There's no reason to have troops over there. We can do everything remotely. And maybe backfill the troops with some kind of contractor or PMC, private military company presence. I don't think the Trump administration would use the term over the horizon capability strictly because that's what the Biden administration called it, and they don't want to associate themselves in any way. That's essentially what we would be relying on to manage a growing threat from al-Shabaab. I think also the Islamic State Somalia, which I've written about, this is a crucial facilitative and logistical hub within the Islamic State's global enterprise. Al-Qarar office is there, and it's moved money throughout the various wilayats. I think it's critical to look at all of these different pieces. I always say the Islamic State is one of those groups where the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. Withdrawing from parts of Somalia, we've seen with Afghanistan what even withdrawing a small number of troops can do. We really lose our eyes and ears there. Even with world-class signals intelligence capabilities, we're not able to triangulate our ints because we almost fully lose our human intelligence network on the ground. Generally, we cede the advantage to any of our adversaries that are willing to fill that power vacuum. It's just kind of a continuation. This isn't a political statement. I think the Biden administration was guilty of this too, that we fully don't understand great power competition in the United States because we say we're withdrawing from Central Asia or the Sahel to focus on great power competition, but that's exactly where it's happening.
I just want to double down on that Africa piece, particularly on Somalia and the Al-Qarar office. I think what people don't understand is that Islamic State in Somalia is able to generate really significant amounts of money and have a very small footprint proportionally, which means that they're running a large surplus. And what they're doing with that money is they're sending it to all of their different affiliates around the world, particularly to Afghanistan, but throughout the African continent as well, allowing these groups to either develop new capabilities or when they hit financial hurdles to sustain them to make sure they're maintaining momentum. This is going to be one of those things that without a sustained U.S. presence and a sustained U.S. interest is going to really go by the wayside because any counterterrorism successes that have been experienced in Somalia against Islamic State Somalia or al-Shabaab over the last 10 or 15 years have been fairly directly attributable to U.S. presence and pressure.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's really a great return on investment for the Islamic State Somalia. Small footprint, large surplus. And they probably did it without a Department of Government Efficiency, unless there's an ISIS Doge wilayat that I'm not aware of.
Oh, goodness. So for those who are not as deep into the global terrorism landscape, I think everybody would be familiar with the concept of al-Shabaab and ISIS existing in Africa. But who are some of the other main players in the region and where are they? And what is the kind of source of their grievance or movement?
Yeah, staying on the African continent, you could look at JNIM in the Sahel, which is an al-Qaeda-linked affiliate, really gobbling up larger swaths of territory, active in multiple areas in West Africa, with a reduced U.S. presence, a reduced French presence. The U.S. is getting pushed closer toward the West African littoral, and looking at countries like Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and others, we've seen JNIM active even in countries where there hasn't been a jihadist presence previously, like Togo and Benin. Over on the southeast Swahili coast, you've got ISIS in Mozambique. You've got an ISIS presence in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You've got an ISIS presence in South Africa. Really, across the entire large continent, you've got jihadist affiliates belonging to either al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. And you've also got, in many of these places, weak states, fragile states, fairly draconian security services. You've got the Wagner Group or Africa Corps in the mix. So it's really a hornet's nest in these various parts of the world, which makes the decision to fold AFRICOM even that much more curious to me. Now, I can already see the counter argument here, which would be, well, terrorism is a big problem in Africa, but it doesn't affect the United States, right? It's largely contained to the continent. Although I believe there was just an ISIS plot in Morocco that was disrupted this week, traced back to Islamic State Sahel province. So I always say these issues are containable until they're not. That was the conventional wisdom about al-Shabaab. It's a regional problem at best, right? We've seen them attack in Uganda and elsewhere until we found a Kenyan al-Shabaab operative in the Philippines taking flight lessons with the ultimate goal of, conducting a 9/11 style aviation attack. So I think just being sanguine about these things and resting on our laurels and saying, well, we expect Africa to be a conflict-ridden continent. Bad things happen there. It doesn't affect us, I think is naive. And it also kind of, overlooks recent history. You could have made the same argument about Afghanistan before 9/11. This is a landlocked country. in Central and South Asia really doesn't have any bearing on the United States. What was the old expression? Why shoot $10 million missiles at $10 tents? We get nothing out of that. And of course, we all know the story of 9/11 and how that was planned from Afghanistan.
Okay, so obviously Hezbollah and Hamas have had quite the year. I think it's fair to say they've had some pretty significant losses this year. So where do you see this going for them over the next 6 to 18 months?
Yeah, I think, and I've written about this recently, I think these are both groups that are far from done. Given the nature of Israel's military campaign across the region over the past 16 months, they've essentially sowed the seeds of a future generation. I warned about this in a foreign affairs piece a year ago. I think Foreign Affairs called it the counterinsurgency trap. I wrote the piece in response to something General Petraeus said, and this is no disrespect to General Petraeus, who's probably forgotten more about counterinsurgency today than I've ever known in my life. But he was saying the Israelis need to do COIN, what we call counterinsurgency, in Gaza. And I thought to myself, what a terrible idea. In no way did the Israelis seem postured to win hearts and minds. This was, I think, a world revenge tour. And it showed in the way that they went about their business in Gaza. Now, a lot of it's to be expected, given the nature of the attack on October 7th, but it's also exactly what Hamas was hoping for. And the Israelis walked right into that trap. They played right into their hands. They've created a new generation of Hamas supporters, not only in Gaza and the Middle East, but in the West. I mean, just look on any college campus. I've never before seen people waving Hamas and Hezbollah flags the way I have recently. It's really sobering. Hezbollah is fully entrenched in Lebanese society. It's part of the social fabric of that country. A lot of that is due to Israeli missteps. An 18-year occupation of southern Lebanon between 1982 and 2000 did a good job toward making sure Hezbollah is going to be around to stay. The piece about Hamas that's really interesting to me, though, is we're having this conversation about the global terrorism threat landscape. We haven't even dug into Afghanistan and the threat posed by ISIS-K, which to me is toward the very top of the list in terms of that bad intersection of intent and capability. We saw last year the Iran attack, the Moscow attack, the Taylor Swift plot, and a plot against the Paris Olympics. So everybody knows ISIS-K. Everybody's concerned about ISIS-K. But before October 7th, I couldn't find more than 5 people that were tracking Hamas. And all 5 of them were probably in Israel. There are these groups that fall off the radar, these back burner groups. It shows the power of terrorism, that you have this group that's kind of just yesterday's news that conducts this attack, that catapults it to the front page of every newspaper in the world and totally upends foreign policy for an entire region. And I think this is the tip of the iceberg. We're still in the very immediate aftermath. This attack's going to, have implications for years to come. HTS was another group. Before the Assad regime was toppled, there was a handful of people really tracking HTS closely. Aaron Zellin, Charles Lister, Doreen Khalifa, Jerome Drevin, and maybe some others, but not many. And now all of a sudden, okay, what do we know about this group? What are their intentions? That's what's so interesting to me, just from a purely clinical perspective. I find it fascinating that there's all these groups out there, and it's not always the ones you're most concerned about that end up being the ones that you end up having to focus on, which is why in my own work, I try to be a bit more of a generalist, instead of saying like, I'm the guy that looks at the PKK, that's all I look at and that's all I think about. I think you have to look at it across the globe, and I think you have to look at it across ideologies, because you don't know which group is going to be the most concerning really until it happens.
I just want to come back to this whole issue around Hamas, because what I think happened is that Israel squandered its moment in terms of how it went about prosecuting its war against Hamas. Because immediately after October 7th, public opinion was with Israel in a way we probably have never seen before they really started their activities in Gaza. There was some movement from states that had not designated Hamas as a terrorist organization who finally got on board with doing that. But then the way things unfolded, we lost a lot of that momentum. And this is a real concern for me, because Hamas's finances are not in Israel. They have been, but they are not currently. What we see instead is this much more diffuse network of finance spread throughout different countries, particularly in places like Turkey, Sudan, and even Algeria, all places that have not designated Hamas as a terrorist organization. So they operate with impunity. This means, and this is some research that I've done fairly recently, one of the main ways that terrorist groups actually end and that we can bring about the end of a terrorist group is by attacking their finances. Kinetic strikes don't do it. But if you combine kinetic strikes and a whole bunch of other counterterrorism efforts with a sustained effort against their finances, then you get things like the LTTE, which hasn't conducted a terrorist attack in how many years now? Well over a decade. To me, this is the future of Hamas in that we haven't got international consensus tackling that group's finances, despite the significant kinetic strikes against them. This is just going to be a resurgent group.
100%. And I think the analogy that you used of Israel squandering its political capital, if you will, it's one of the reasons that motivated me to write the foreign affairs piece. And I was essentially saying, don't make the mistakes the United States did. After 9/11, the world was with us up until March 2003 when we invaded Iraq. Use that moment to bring countries together, to put an end to this once and for all, to forge consensus, right? No one's going to sign their name saying we support Hamas and what they just did. They just slaughtered 1,200 innocent civilians. But when you turn around and then slaughter 50,000 Palestinians, well, you've lost all that goodwill and then some. So it was really just, and again, when we talk about terrorism, this is a large part of what terrorist groups try to do. They try to get you to overreact. They're trying to goad you in, right? Death by 1,000 paper cuts. And it's also not just about the body count, although in the case of October 7th, it was tremendous. It's the psychological impact. And that's what we're seeing now. And that's something, when you look at the incident in Amsterdam going back a couple of months, where you had Israeli soccer fans getting into skirmishes and fights with individuals of Middle Eastern and North African descent in the Netherlands. This is where the conflict has come into the West on a regular basis. I keep a close enough eye on what happens in Montreal and Toronto on a regular basis, where there's a huge spike in anti-Semitism and related issues, to see that this is what a terrorist group wants.
You did mention Syria as well. Can you talk a little bit about your projections or assessment of the new sheriff in town, if you will, in Syria? I hesitate to call it government, but I guess that is what it is at the moment. You foresee there?
Yeah, I mean, Syria is a really interesting case to me. One, I think just from taking off my analyst hat and just from a human perspective, I'm really glad to see Bashar al-Assad gone. This is one of the worst dictators or butchers in modern memory. And so the fact that that regime collapsed, I think, is generally a good thing. A former al-Qaeda and Syria leader backfilling Assad probably wouldn't have been my first choice. I know everybody's rushing to fet him and talk about, how he's changed and he's no longer a jihadist. And he definitely got a good McKinsey-style makeover. He's saying all the right things. He's got some good talking points. His beard is nice and trimmed. And
decent tailor.
He's got better suits than I have. So there's a lot of hope there, but I think there's a lot of risk as well. So just think about what Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was, fairly brutal jihadist group operating in Idlib and parts of northwest Syria. That doesn't translate easily into a government, right? If you look at some of the members of HTS, not all of these folks are going to be generally pleased with governing, right? They're kind of hardcore, particularly some of the Central Asians in that group. And so that's a big concern that I have, is that some of those groups may splinter off and set their sights on the West. They may attack Russia. They may try to attack China. They've got a long list of grievances there. More generally, the U.S. is talking about withdrawing from Syria. There's an attempt to fold the Kurds now into a broader Syrian army, which would be really difficult to pull off. If you look at the Kurds and the threat from the Turks, that's a major concern, obviously, there. And then we've said nothing about the camps in northeastern Syria that still house tens of thousands of ISIS foreign fighters and their families. It's really a powder keg in many ways. I think the camps in particular, Al-Hol, Roj, and some others, it's really the kind of culmination of a policy of kick the can down the road that Western countries largely followed of, I don't want to deal with this threat. I'm going to kind of pretend it doesn't exist. But that's really, I think, we talk all the time about black swans, events that are difficult to predict with huge impact. This isn't a black swan. It's easy to predict what could happen there. The blueprint is what happened in Hasaka in January 2022, which is a large-scale prison break. And I think the Islamic State will have its eyes closely surveilling what goes on there. If the SDF, the Kurds that are in charge of guarding those prisons, either have conflict with the Turks across the border and that distracts them, or they're pulled away to man some other part of the country. That's a real glaring vulnerability in my mind, and it's one that you could easily see ISIS taking advantage of.
Yeah, it's really difficult to be living in a world where we have threats that we couldn't anticipate, but then to have threats that we could anticipate go completely unmitigated.
Sure.
Is really difficult, I think.
Yeah.
Well, now you're just preaching my language because I've been yelling about this since I went there in 2019. I could do a whole podcast where I just rant about the fact that we left our foreign fighters to be taken care of by the victims of their atrocities. But we should probably move on. I do have a question, though. Speaking of foreign fighters, are any of these movements actually attracting foreign fighters from the West or elsewhere? We've seen them from the Caucasus, but is this still an issue? Could it become a greater issue moving forward if we take our eye off the ball?
Yeah, so Islamic State Somalia has been attracting foreign fighters from throughout the African continent, from the immediate region, and even a little bit further afield, some from the Middle East. They've been volunteering as suicide bombers in the conflict there. Austin Doctor's done some really good work on foreign fighters to that particular conflict. The fact that Somalia is a bit further afield than Syria, it's not as central to the narrative and the lore of global jihad. The conditions are a bit more austere, right? I'm not sure how readily you can get your hands on Nutella, which I know is a big draw for many of the Europeans to go to the caliphate. So all of these things together work in our favor, but it also shows. I remember having a conversation with somebody in the intelligence community years back. We were talking about some of Thomas Hegghammer's work on foreign fighter mobilizations, particularly his international security piece. Why do we keep seeing larger and larger numbers of foreign fighters mobilizing and going to conflicts? Part of it really is just a byproduct of globalization. It's a lot easier to travel to a place, stay connected, to move money. All of these things are facilitated by globalization and technology. When we talk about ISIS in particular, there's a lot of hyperbole that surrounds the group. It was this real juggernaut that caught us off guard and had kind of built this proto-state seemingly overnight, although it wasn't overnight for those of us that have been watching this for a long time. But the two areas where the hyperbole wasn't an exaggeration and was legit, one was financing. Jess, you've done a lot of work on this, as I have over the years. They really were a well-oiled machine, no pun intended, when it came to bringing in revenues. The other piece was social media, and that was not an accident. I wrote a piece with Charlie Winter years ago for War on the Rocks where we talked about the deliberate nature of them recruiting people that had a background in graphic design and publishing. The narratives were really strong. They were really compelling. They wouldn't have been at a place other than the ultimate goal on Madison Avenue because they were tailored. They were segmented. The message that went out to Uyghurs was much different than the message that went out to 20-year-old kids in Molenbeek, Belgium. They knew exactly what buttons to push. And I think as that becomes more sophisticated, we're going to continue to see this foreign fighter phenomenon be a real challenge.
I just want to follow up on that because what the Islamic State did from the financing perspective is really establish a blueprint that they then exported to other areas where they have either groups, provinces, or even sometimes cells. So they have this whole blueprint where they can figure out how to raise money and manage it. And they sometimes send external advisors. And we know that that's happening and continues to happen. And so I'm just wondering on the propaganda piece, Colin, is the blueprint that they established in Syria and Iraq the same blueprint that they're deploying now, particularly from Afghanistan, but from other parts of the world as well?
That's the part about the blueprint, is that it's somewhat malleable, right? It gives you the basics, and the rest is tailored to your individual circumstances, geography, etc. And I think without controlling those large swaths of territory, it becomes a lot more difficult. This is something you and I talked about going back years. There was so much focus on the Islamic State's revenue and what they were able to do and how they were able to do it. There was much less on what they spent it on, which is largely internal. They were running a government, paying for schools and hospitals. A lot of it was reinvested back into the caliphate. I think a lot of that money has been stashed away for a rainy day. Some of it's at work in Turkey, in different networks there, through front companies, and that money has kind of been moved literally around the world. But I do think And it's not just for ISIS, it's for any other group that's paying close attention, how to replicate that, right? How to go about doing the same things. Now, the oil is a bit unique, right? Like the amount of money they were making from oil, you're not going to see that elsewhere. But the mafia-style activities of extortion, taxation, kidnapping for ransom, armed robbery, all these are various elements that other groups can plug and play depending on what the circumstances are on the ground, whether they're in the Philippines, Mali, Uzbekistan, etc.
Speaking of criminal activity to support terrorism, let's turn our attention to using terrorism to fight criminal activity. We've recently seen in the US and in Canada a series of cartels designated as terrorist entities. Do you actually see that being more than just signaling? Do you see the full suite of counterterrorism tools unlocked by a US designation being used against cartels?
The honest answer is I don't know, and I don't know that the administration does either. I've gone on the record. I wrote a piece in the LA Times a few years ago talking about why it would be a bad idea. Let me start with this. I do think the issues that the designation are intended to address are real. We have a major fentanyl problem in this country, and I think cracking down on the flow of fentanyl across the borders is urgent. Now, we can differ on how to go about that. There's a lot of problems with designating Mexican cartels or groups like Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan prison gang that's become a transnational criminal organization, or MS-13. They're motivated by profits, not by politics. And so they're two different things. Calling them FTOs not only is inaccurate, but it kind of blurs the lines and dilutes the foreign terrorist organization list. If every criminal gang is a terrorist, how is that different than saying they're a criminal gang? It just doesn't make much sense on the face of it. Mexico, the other day, Claudia Sheinbaum, the Mexican president, came out and said 3/4 of the guns used by these groups are sourced in the United States. Jess, you're probably more of an expert on this than I am. All sorts of lawsuits against U.S. gun manufacturers and others. And I think the lawsuit piece is interesting. If the Sinaloa cartel is now a foreign terrorist organization, who's doing their street level dealing in Chicago? It's probably some 17-year-old gang member on the south side of Chicago. Should he be hit with a material support charge and thrown in jail for a long period of time for doing kind of minor hand-to-hand drug dealing on the streets? What happens to the whole system of processing people also at a time when we're drastically reducing the size of our government? So it just seems antithetical to me. There has been reporting by CNN, Natasha Bertrand, and some others about increased CIA surveillance flights against some of these groups. But I kind of posted on X the other day, what's the plan? So, okay, we're surveilling these groups. Are we going to launch kinetic strikes? My sense is that these groups have the capability to respond in the United States. If they're active, if their networks are here, their distribution networks, does the response look like what we used to see in Colombia with the cartels down there, with Pablo Escobar, Medellin, and the Cali cartels, which is car bombs, assassinations? Do we really want some kind of urban warfare on U.S. soil against drug trafficking networks? And will the administration take responsibility for that? Or is it just another, well, this is the fault of the Biden administration and immigrants? But it's a real problem, and it's a real thing to consider. Poking that hornet's nest, it does nothing to reduce the demand for drugs in the United States. And that may be dismissed as being soft on crime or soft on drugs, but it's a real issue. Why do we have such an urgent demand in our population for these drugs?
Yeah, fentanyl isn't produced in large grow-op situations. There's not massive drying facilities. A good amount of the drug can be made in somebody's kitchen. So unless you're dropping many, many, many bombs in terms of actually disrupting production, it seems like a fool's errand.
Look, we've done the war on drugs. I think it's safe to say that drugs won. We like declaring war on things in the United States, and I think it's not helpful. It's a way to simplify things for the population, right? This is the war on crime, the war on poverty, the war on gluten. I'm actually for that one, but it's the same thing with the war on terror. It was such a misnomer, and it really made very little sense. We should have called it the war on Al-Qaeda, but we said, no, it's the war on terror, and these people attacked us because they hate our freedom. I'm like, well, why did they attack like a really free country then, like Sweden? Why go after us?
Well, in a previous episode, I called it the war on terror on drugs. So, which We can
We
look
say
at
that.
effectiveness later. Jess, you also raised some interesting points previously, and now that we've actually seen the designations, I wonder what your thoughts are after the Canadian designations at the behest of the U.S. government and what you've seen in terms of Canada's position. What are your thoughts about that move?
My thoughts are largely the same as they were in the last episode, but I'll recap for Colin, who probably hasn't had a chance to listen, and for any of our listeners who have just joined us. Technically, I think that the listings in Canada aren't lawful. I think they do still stand up based on how our criteria is set out in terms of being quite loose, actually, in terms of establishing what a terrorist organization entity is. What it actually does, though, I don't think that there's much of anything. I've seen some public statements from the government and government proximate officials talking about it unlocking all these tools. They have not been specific about what those tools are. There are differences in the United States. You know, if you have a terrorist organization, I think that unlocks a lot of extraterritorial activities that Canada does not do. We don't conduct airstrikes against terrorist organizations abroad, drone strikes, that kind of thing, unless we're in an active war in that particular context. None of those things apply in the Canadian side. And one of the examples that I used was that, say you have, let's use MS-13, say you have your financial institution. A lot of the listing effects are financial in nature. So maybe you've got an account. Somehow you've identified that this is an MS-13 affiliate or an individual who has an account at your financial institution. You're now going to report that as terrorist property and you're going to submit a suspicious transaction report. But were you not already submitting that information under anti-money laundering legislation? You absolutely were. There's no reason to think that that wouldn't have already happened. So it's really symbolic, and almost in a lot of ways I would describe it as diminishes the signaling power of our terrorism list, because
it waters it down.
That's it. Like, if everything is a terrorist organization, then nothing is. And there's also some other funny little analytic issues that arise when you start calling everything terrorism. In the anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing world, I've spent a lot of time pulling those two things apart. Counter-terrorist financing looks nothing like anti-money laundering, and these things should not even, in my mind, live together in terms of global governance, because money laundering is this huge problem and terrorist financing is a small problem. So the terrorist financing gets subsumed into the money laundering and is like an add-on at the end of a day's work for the Financial Action Task Force. This is just exacerbating that problem. So we're now putting everything under this terrorism umbrella, which is going to affect analytics, how things get reported, and trends and typologies, how things get detected and disrupted. There's a lot of second order effects that I think are not great and probably quite bad over time. And I think they ultimately make us less safe. And the last thing that I'll follow up on is something, again, that I mentioned. We've established a terrible precedent by listing terrorist organizations because the United States asked us to do that. What happens when President Trump decides that they want to designate Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and then turns to Canada and says, you now have to do this too, or by the way, we're going to kick you out of the Five Eyes. We're doing it, obviously.
Yeah, the one thing that I hadn't really thought of, and I don't think anyone in the media has reported, at least in the Canadian context, and I think, Jess, you're absolutely right to say that it doesn't lock on a lot of tools for the Canadians as it does in the United States when you get to now use the authorization to use military force to engage in certain things abroad. But in the Canadian context, technically, that's now puts fentanyl trafficking and these cartels under the purview of CSIS, which I think would be interesting. Not like they had enough to do as it was already, but definitely not something that CSIS has typically been engaged in looking at, which is organized crime. And the other thing, in terms of actual law enforcement tools, it unlocks not very many new ones, because many of the same perks you get if you're investigating terrorism, being able to get warrants for longer on easier grounds, being able to get higher sentences for certain things, already exists when the indictable offense you're dealing with is done on behalf of organized crime. It doesn't unlock a lot for law enforcement, but it does unlock CSIS for Canada writ large.
I do also want to say, though, I've worked in both, obviously, like organized crime and counterterrorism here in Canada. And my understanding of that division of labor between CSIS and the RCMP on specifically like the serious organized crime file was one more of convention and resource allocation than of specific differentiation, because you can always argue that serious organized crime is a threat to the security of Canada. It doesn't easily fall under any of the parts of the act, but there was always a bit of a case to be made that it could have fallen into any of those categories. But yeah, now it definitely does. And I think the question becomes, is CSIS ready to allocate resources accordingly?
One thing we talked about was the United States squeezing us to list, for example, Antifa. But one organization we have listed in Canada is the Proud Boys, which the Trump administration just pardoned a number of them. So we've seen favorable actions by the Trump administration to members of what we deem to be right-wing extremist groups. We recently just saw in Germany, the far-right party take more seats than ever before. Right-wing extremism remains a rising concern. So, Colin, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this side of the terrorism bucket for 2025.
And before you answer that, I also want to add on the whole issue of Navarro in Russia. And I want to get your take on that and Russia's role in fostering these kinds of networks.
Yeah, well, I think the question is timely. I just finished writing something looking at a lot of these groups, what we traditionally call racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, groups like Adam Waffen, the Base, all of their spin-offs, all of their cheerleaders and supporters worldwide.
Sorry, I'll just note are all designated entities in Canada.
Sure. And in other countries like Australia and elsewhere. The groups that scare me the most are what we call militia violent extremists. Those are your kind of oath keepers, 3%ers. Proud Boys fall a little bit further on down the totem pole for me. It's just still hard for me to get over how lame some of these people are. It's hard to take those types of people seriously. But again, I'm a big believer at taking people at their word, especially anti-government extremists, right? But the militia violent extremists, they're the strong silent type. They're not out there shit posting online. What they are doing is organizing and stockpiling weapons. That's a more long-term entrenched threat for me. That's where the next Timothy McVeigh is going to come from, one of those types of organizations. If you look abroad, in the United States, we don't have any far-right groups listed as an FTO. We do have two listed as what we call an SDGT, especially designated global terrorist. The first is the Russian Imperial Movement, or RIM, and the other is the Nordic Resistance Movement, and that's more recently a group in Scandinavia. So this is very much still a thing. It's far more decentralized than a lot of the jihadist groups. A lot of it is very online, and a lot of the adherents are quite young. We've seen, especially in the UK over the years, some really, really young neo-Nazis, 14, 15, 16 years old, which makes this a generational issue, right? Even when some of these people are apprehended, arrested, punished, they're coming out of prison and they're still in their 20s. Sometimes they're even more radicalized on the back end than they were going in. We don't necessarily do a good job when we put people in prison of providing them with rehabilitation. It's meant to be punitive. And what better place to find other white supremacists than in jail? It's like a big networking party. Right-wing extremism is still a huge concern, but I'd also be remiss if I didn't flag that I'm expecting to see a rise in left-wing or far-left violence in the United States, whether that's from anarchist types or radical environmental groups. We did a podcast in the lead up to the election. We had Brian Jenkins, Julia Ebner, Michael Kenny, and some other folks. One of the issues that came up was Michael Kenny's interviews with far left extremists, including violent anarchists. They said if Trump is elected, they see it as existential, and they'd be more willing to press the envelope than in the past. That's something we need to be careful of. There's also this concept of reciprocal radicalization. As the far right becomes more prominent, more active, the far left in response, right? What does Antifa stand for? Anti-fascist. Well, if people perceive their government as being taken over by fascists, you're going to have a larger anti-fascist element grow in tandem with that in response. That's to say nothing of what we call salad bar extremists. This is people that feel comfortable taking bits and pieces of different ideologies from across the spectrum. We've had cases where people are enamored by neo-Nazis and jihadists, and they don't see any discrepancy there. Then you have these other very strange groups like Order of the Nine Angles to sprinkle in a little Satanism and pedophilia of regular garden variety. Extremism wasn't enough. You have these other really demented twists. And then I think just general kind of violent nihilism, the 764 group that spend most of their time trying to convince people they've never met to harm or kill themselves or kill animals. Pretty grim view of humanity when we see what's going on out there and how people spend their time in the world. But inevitably, these all fall under the counterterrorism umbrella in one way or another, because many of these people are violent, they are extreme, and some of them are looking to attack civilians, law enforcement, and military.
Throughout this episode, we've covered the most likely threats, but there's also what we call in the military situation most deadly. So it may not be the most likely, but could potentially on the horizon be the most deadly kind of attack or the most dangerous attack. If you had to make a prediction, Colin, do you see anything in terms of the situation most deadly?
A famous baseball player named Yogi Berra, also kind of a quasi-philosopher for us here in the United States, once said, "I don't like making predictions, especially about the future." My addendum to that is I don't like making predictions about the future in the Middle East, because you can really wind up with egg on your face. But one thing I've been thinking a lot about is, what are the implications of a severely weakened Iran? We know what the implications of a very strong Iran are. And now we're in a situation where I'm waiting for some kind of Israeli attack against Iran's nuclear facilities. I think that that's something we could see in the first half of 2025, before the summer, and likely with assistance from the United States, certainly with the wink, if not logistical assistance to make that happen. And a weakened Iran, to me, is in many ways more dangerous than a strong Iran. I think back to 1992, after Abbas Mousawi was killed, the leader of Hezbollah at the time. Hezbollah responded and Iran responded by attacking Israeli and Jewish targets in Argentina. Really massive attacks. Terrorism, not conventional conflict, is the Iranians' comparative advantage. I think we could end up in a situation where we see some kind of a Khobar Tower style attack, which occurred in 1996 in Saudi Arabia against U.S. military facilities. I think we could see something that we saw in East Africa in 1998 in Kenya and Tanzania, although that was Al-Qaeda, it wasn't Iran or Hezbollah. Attacks against Israeli or American embassies, the kidnapping of Israeli or American citizens abroad. Or we could see attacks like we did against hotels in Jakarta or Islamabad, right? Kind of civilian targets. That's Iran's bread and butter. They can do it. That concerns me over the coming year. How does Iran lash out to settle the score?
Well, as our frequent listeners know, we always end on a really optimistic, heartening note. You don't come to Secure Line to feel good about the world. Colin, thank you. There was a real tour de force of the global terrorism landscape. I could not think of a better person to take us through that journey. Thank you very much for being here. And thanks to Jess, as always, for your exceptional insight. If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you give us a like, a follow, share with your friends, colleagues, mother, boss, dog walker, and join us next time. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you.